My name is John Graves, and I'm legal counsel of Vision America, and in partnership with FRC and Watchmen on the Wall, I wanted to give a brief legal overview of some of the misconceptions of legal issues to culture impact teams that apply also to pastors, churches, and parachurch ministries. Most of the time when people talk about the legal issues that churches and pastors get into, there is an enormous amount of misunderstanding and a lot of fear and a lot of confusion, and that's the way the enemy wants it. I want to try my best to simplify this issue and empower culture impact team leaders to share this with their pastors, to share this link with their pastors, and for pastors who watch this to also understand that it's not that complicated and you have enormous freedoms. The First Amendment is primarily what deals with churches and with pastors and with religious liberty, or freedom to believe, to preach, to educate your people. And what happens a lot of times is we get lost in the IRS or fear of the IRS. So I want to give you a visual picture that I hope helps you. A church emanates, its protection is emanated under the Constitution, under the First Amendment. And the best way that I could say this is if you think in terms of the Constitution and in terms of the IRS, you've got to understand the Constitution is eminently more powerful. It was almost 137 years before we even had an IRS under the Constitution, and the Constitution had to be amended. When they tried to start taxing people, the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. And so in order to adjust the Constitution, you have to have a super majority. 2/3 of the House or the Senate have to initiate something like this to amend the Constitution. And we see in our modern times that we can't even get past one branch of government needing 60 votes to get anything done in Washington. And instead, you have to have 2/3 of the Senate, the House, and then to ratify it, 3/4, 75% have to change it. So keep in your mind, culture impact team leaders or pastors, all the time that the Constitution is what protects your religious liberty. The Constitution far outweighs if you're working within a church. The rules are slightly different and less favorable if you're a parachurch. Some of you will be working with them. But as long as you're in the confines of a local church, which is primarily what we do with Vision America and Watchmen on the Wall, as we reach out to pastors and raise up culture impact team leaders, is the Constitution is where your protection emanates. So think of a picture like this. If you had a tank, and that tank is the culture impact team leader or the pastor standing in the pulpit, that's who he is, and his power emanates from the Constitution. And then you have a flimsy piece of paper called an IRS revenue ruling or a letter ruling. This is what gives you permission. This is not needed if you're a church. It's not needed under the Constitution. The protections, this is the number one confusion that pastors have, is they blanket the tank in this and think if anything ever gets damaged with this, we're in trouble. It doesn't. There are only 2 limits that even apply to this, and only once in our history has a church been denied, and it was a clear violation of what a church should not do, not what the pastor should not do. And even then, it made absolutely zero difference. The church could still keep doing what the church did. And so the way I want to explain this is in forms of permissions. I don't want to tell pastors and culture impact team leaders, this is what you can't do, make sure not to do this, be careful about this. There's really only 2 major issues that a parachurch or the church itself in its official capacity needs to be cautious of if it even cares about this outside letter. Many churches, there's no need to have this, and many churches have gotten to where they don't even do this. I recommend to any pastor I know, and I know many of them, if you start another church, if you're going to start a church, don't even apply for this. One of the questions that comes up, what about sales tax? Well, you file in your state as a nonprofit corporation. That's what you're going to show to avoid sales tax. You don't need this letter. Parachurches, a little bit different. You emanate under this, and so you have 2 minor limitations, if you will. So what I want to do is just give you the bulk of what most of the time are the big issues that people are concerned about that they can or cannot do. Pastors can preach, they can pray, and they can partner with other believers. Watchmen on the Wall, that's called a P3 pastor. So if you're a P3 pastor, there is nothing in the IRS or in the Constitution that says you have a limitation of what you can do with those pastors, with preaching sermons. You can talk about issues, you can talk about legislation, you can talk about candidates, and in fact, you can even explain the position of a candidate. If there's confusion that the media is spinning an issue a certain way, you can explain in the pulpit. A culture impact team leader can explain or do handouts. You can pass out voting guides that explain those issues. One of the questions that comes up a lot of times is voter registration drives. Voter registration drives, traditionally, for the churches that do engage in that, they set up a table in the lobby maybe, or they can send an email now with online registration in most states. You can send a mail piece out encouraging your church, because most of us understand that about 50% of the Christians are not even registered to vote, and so they can't even get in the game to be salt and light in their community. However, you can go further than that. I was meeting just this week with a church, group of pastors, and they were asking about the issue of, well, could we collect those voter registrations? In many states, you need to be careful with this. This is not a constitutional issue. This is a local election issue that you need to be a deputy registrar. Not all states require that, but some do. If you do, most of the time, there's no legal risk whatsoever to the church. There's very simply an issue of going to the county and maybe having a 15 to 30-minute training, and then you're certified into the state to simply collect those at church. One of the churches that we talked to one of the pastors came up with a brilliant idea that instead of waiting and doing the booth, instead of doing it twice a year, have everyone stand. If you're registered, sit down, hand the voter guide right there to them, stamped envelope, let them fill it out during a worship song, and then bring it as an act of worship and cover it in prayer to the altar with deputy registrars if your state even needs that, and then the issue is dealt with. In addition, the issue of voter guides comes up a lot. In elections, most voters get overwhelmed. Sometimes we get a lot of commercials about maybe the White House race or some of the controversial Senate races, but as it goes down ballot and becomes more and more local, I know I've heard pastor after pastor, culture impact teams are constantly dealing with this issue. How can we educate and inform our pastor and our church? Well, there are several groups. FRC normally puts these out. There are many different groups that will post them, and make sure that they have those in legal compliance. There's very simple things that they have to do, like include all of the candidates. They have to apply the same standard to that, and that usually is not a problem. One of the other things that comes up is how involved can our culture impact team be? Can we do all these things? Remember that there's always two issues. There's you as a person, a culture impact team leader, or a pastor. You do not relinquish your constitutional rights. Remember, always think positive. The First Amendment was meant to guarantee your right to religious expression. You were free to believe, and that can't be taken away from you, to express your freedom to believe or have these religious convictions. And don't think in the negative of what you can and can't do. The limitations almost never apply to a person unless that person is acting on behalf of the church. And frankly, the church has very few limitations. If they haven't applied for this letter that we talked about, then they don't even have to worry about that issue. In fact, there's teams of lawyers, Alliance Defending Freedom, Liberty Counsel, Matt Staver, many of those firms, Kelly Shackelford, that will help defend pastors if any of these issues ever come up. So what are the limitations? If a church can do all of these things, what are some of the things that a culture impact team can be mindful of? What I like to do is take a very conservative approach. If the limitations are only in the church, one of the things that we do, and we'll make this available on the website, you will be able to download a simple volunteer acknowledgement form that says these two limitations that you can't do. If you do them, you're acting on your own accord as a citizen and not on behalf of the church. It gives the peace of mind to the pastor who doesn't understand these things. The pastors are very busy. They have many things going on. Culture impact team leaders sometimes can be intimidated by this. If you have an attorney in your church, try to go to them and see if they have any interest. If they don't, go to some of these resources that are on our website. So what are the limitations? The two limitations are that you cannot do electioneering. You can't endorse a candidate as the church. And this is tricky Because what happens with the church is a pastor can say, I endorse this candidate. He can even give his title as the pastor of this church. But what he needs to do is say that my title is given just for identification purposes. And the second limitation is lobbying, which even a church can lobby. Most people are surprised by this, but you can. You can do petition drives. You can turn out for legislative issues. If someone's appointed as a judge and not elected, that becomes a lobbying issue. But the only limitation is the church, not a person, not the culture impact team leader or the pastor. The church needs to make sure that stays below at least 15%, but it would be safe to be 5% of all activity. And if you start breaking that apart, it is almost impossible to have that much activity. And I've never met a pastor yet who wants to spend 85% of their time or more than 15% of their time doing lobbying activity. And so in closing, if you will simply think of you as a citizen, as a culture impact team leader, or as your pastor, when you explain this to him, that's like a tank. It has constitutional protections. If somebody tries to attack it, there may be a piece of paper. But if that piece of paper is ripped to pieces, it doesn't change one thing about you as a citizen or about what a pastor can do or the fact that the church is protected by the Constitution of the United States. Two simple things. As a church, try not to endorse, give money to a candidate. You can do that as a culture impact team leader or as a pastor. Try to make sure the church itself doesn't do that and make sure the church, as it does lobbying work, is very limited in that. So there's plenty of other resources that are out there. Alliance Defending Freedom, Liberty Counsel, they have great articles, lengthy articles, charts that can answer specific questions, and they're always happy to answer those. We're happy to answer those as well if you want to call us. But the issue to keep in mind is don't make this complicated. Don't overanalyze it. There's very, very strict limitations, and they've never really limited your freedom to speak. And so what we hope that this does is empowers you to be an outspoken Christian for the issues of our day. Thank you.